About 20 years ago, I was woken up in the middle of the night by the feeling of someone sitting on the edge of my bed. I expected to see one of my kids, but instead, I saw an unfamiliar young woman watching me. I asked who she was, but she didn't answer. I asked what she wanted. Again, she didn't answer. She never said anything. After a few minutes, she stood up and watched me for another couple of minutes. And then she smiled and walked into my closet. We had just moved back in with my parents after my husband had broken his back and couldn't work, and there were still boxes stacked up in front of the closet door waiting to be unpacked. And this girl walked through the boxes. And the house had been built by my father when I was 1. On property that had been farmland belonging to my great-grandfather, so I don't think anyone had died there. I was thinking it was a dream or hallucination, but then I was telling my younger brother, who still lived at the home, about my strange dream, and he described exactly what she was wearing. I never saw her again, and no longer live there. However, I still get that feeling of someone sitting on my bed in the middle of the night, and it freaks me out. I was living with my mother and sister in a very small one-bedroom apartment in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and we barely had a bed to sleep on, so I would sleep on the floor. I was 5 and my parents had just split up. Being so little, I couldn't really understand what was happening, but my mom always made us happy and was loving. I remember one particular night when we were sleeping on the floor, and my sister and I were asleep on the bed. I woke up on a hot summer night and popped my head up and asked my mom if she could get me a glass of water. She was closer to the door and the bed touched both sides of the room, so the only way for me to get myself a glass of water was to climb on top of everyone. So she gladly said yes and got up, but when she got to the door frame, she froze. From the bedroom, you would be able to see all the way down to the kitchen. To the right of the room was the bathroom, and the left was the living room. I got up and asked my mom if she was okay, and as I asked, a tall, dark figure with a fedora, coat, and a briefcase walked from the living room to the bathroom. I wasn't freaked out. I thought it was my mom's boyfriend at the time, but I remembered he wasn't there that night. Then after the tall, dark figure walked into the bathroom, my mom snapped out of it and proceeded to the kitchen. I was so confused and looked at the restroom and saw no lights on, and the door was wide open. I thought he was just messing around, but my mom got the water and gave it to me and asked why I was standing up. I answered, "Who was that man, Mom?" And she had a tired, confused look on her face and said that I needed to go to sleep and that I had school in the morning. To this day, my mom never knew what I was talking about, and just recently I saw on TikTok a lot of people saw this guy and even talked to them, hugged them, or would do stuff with them to make them feel better. He wasn't scary, it was just odd. I'm 22 years old, and I remember all of it like as if it happened last night. I lived in an apartment downtown above the greeting card store in Red Wing, Minnesota about 20 years ago. It's a very old building from 1870. I was 20 when I signed the lease and celebrated my 21st birthday while living in that apartment. It was a fantastic location downtown. I didn't have a car, so I loved living only blocks from work, my best friend's house, and my parents' house. The rent was cheap, the apartment was nice, had high ceilings, and big architectural windows. I hardly had to pay for heat as the store downstairs leaked heat up to me. It was a great apartment. I really loved that place when I first moved in. My opinion changed after having 2 supernatural experiences. I only lived there for a year and moved out the second my lease was up. I am not sure if it was a ghost or a malicious demonic spirit that I encountered there. I hope someone has blessed or exorcised the building by now. One evening, I saw the upper torso of a shadow person peering around the door jamb while it was spying on me in my bedroom. It was completely black with no features. It had to be about 6 feet tall since its head was just below the door jamb, and it was leaning to the side to peek around the doorway. As soon as I made eye contact, it immediately retreated behind the door. It was gone when I woke up. My boyfriend, who had spent the night over, and I wasted several minutes searching for an intruder. I was a skeptic at this point, and he was able to convince me that it must have been a nightmare. I never felt right in that apartment afterwards. And another incident. I was home alone. It was daylight out, and I was in the bedroom and heard someone rattling my apartment's door handle. It was very aggressive, and I assumed someone was trying to force their way into the apartment. It was extremely terrifying, but I worked up the nerve to approach the door and called out, but did not get any response from whoever was on the other side of the door. So I checked the peephole. There was no one in the hallway. The hallway does have a 90-degree turn in it, though. I told myself that perhaps a prankster or burglar had fled when they heard me approach the door. I called the police and an officer came to check. Since our building was secure and only the landlord and tenants had a key to the outside doors, it did not take them long to determine that there was no one on the property that didn't belong there. I had him file the report and for years had convinced myself that a human being had been endangering me that day, not something supernatural. Now that I'm willing to admit to myself that there was something supernatural and very unfriendly in that building, I keep finding myself hoping something has been done to get rid of it. I can't help but ask if anyone else had any experiences in that building. I wonder if it was just one entity or 2 different things. I can't really call myself a skeptic anymore, but I don't know what exactly it was I had encountered. I'm 17 years old. I know what you're thinking. It's just this kid's imagination. Just let me tell this story, and you can decide if you think it's real or not. It was mid-December to late December 2020 in central Pennsylvania. I honestly didn't think we had any Skinwalkers here until now. I was at my family's cabin hunting like most Pennsylvanians do in December. I was going to be there for 2 weeks with my dad, brother, and grandfather. We arrived the first day at 4:45 p.m., so we still had some hunting light left. So we grabbed our rifles and headed out. We got some light snow in the morning, and we could see the tracks easier, but enough to get stuck or lost. We walked for roughly 5 minutes, when we finally came across some tracks. There were 2 sets and some scat. We could tell by the size of the scat, one was a buck. My brother and dad went after one set of tracks, and the other, and I, followed the tracks until the brush was getting too thick for me to see past 30 yards. So I decided to sit up against a tree with my rifle. About 15 minutes later, I was eating a snack and drinking some water when it sounded like I went deaf. There was no noise in the whole woods. It sounded quiet when I heard a loud crunch and a pop of sticks and leaves. It sounded way too heavy to be a deer, but couldn't have been a bear since we didn't see many in the winter. The one way I knew something was not right was the awful smell of meat that sat in the sun for 2 weeks. 5 minutes later, everything was still very quiet, when I suddenly got this feeling of being watched. Now, I don't get scared easily, but I got up, packed all my stuff, grabbed my gun, and walked slowly looking behind me every few yards. When I finally got back to the camp at 5:54 roughly, and it was dark, I saw my brother, dad, and grandfather sitting around the campfire eating hot dogs and beans. I pulled up a chair and got a hot dog and started to eat it when my dad asked, "Did you see anything?" I sat and thought for a minute. No, nothing but snow and birds, thinking it was a good idea to hide what I smelt and heard. Later that night, I laid down. I thought about it some more and texted a family friend. He was 49, maybe 50, and the smartest outdoorsman I knew. "Hey, so I had a weird experience in the woods today." He texts back, "What happened, son?" I said, "This terrible smell, like I've never smelled before, and these really big footsteps way bigger than a deer." He said, "Smell? What kind of smell?" I said, "Like someone left meat out in the sun for days." And he texted, "Oh, I was worried you would say that. Let me tell you a story. So I was 27 in 1999, and I was hunting deep in the backwoods. I was sitting there for some time when this smell overcame me. It smelled like rotting flesh, and everything went silent. I couldn't see anything, but about 15 minutes later, I heard someone say my name and say, 'Come here.' The only part was, it was my mom's voice, clear as day. The thing is, she died 2 years ago. I ran and never looked back and never hunted there again. I dropped my phone from pure shock. I pulled my blankets up and didn't want to move. I had a terrible nightmare of a deer that wasn't really a deer chasing me, and I fell, and right before he attacked me, I woke up sweating and screaming. The next day, we went out for our second day of hunting, and I walked to a tree stand we put up that summer. I got in, and about an hour or so later, everything was silent, and I heard the walking again, and the smell was back. The only difference this time is, I could see it. Raggy skin, almost like it didn't fit. No tail, and the skin on the face was dropping way down below where it should be. I pulled my gun, shaking like never before, looked down the scope, and shot it twice. It ran so fast into the bushes, while screaming and crying like crazy. 5 minutes later, my dad radioed me asking if I got one. I said, "Well, I shot something that looked like a deer. I don't know what it was. Please just get here." I said as I dropped my radio to the ground. My brother, dad, and grandfather all came with their guns 15 minutes later, and I was still in the tree stand shaking. They had to help me down from it, and they asked me when I shot, and I said, "I think it was a doe, but it was different." I told them what it was. They didn't believe me, which I don't blame them. It was crazy to think that I barely believed myself. And the scariest part of it all happened. We all heard our mom's voices say our name and say, "Where are you?" Yeah, that's right. We all heard our own mothers say the same thing. My grandfather heard his, my dad his, and my brother and I ours. We all looked at each other and got out of there, and then we heard a baby crying. We felt bad, but we had to go. We knew it wasn't real. We got to the cabin, and while we were packing, we heard a thud. I opened the door with rifle in hand and saw 2 dead rabbits on the porch with their stomachs ripped out. We got out of there, ran to the truck, rifle still in hand. We got in and drove fast as we could, and that was the longest ride ever. We sold that property since none of us would go back. The new owners have had it for roughly a year, and now just started having problems. Perhaps we should tell them what happened to us. This is an incident that happened to a friend's friend when she was 7. It happened when she was visiting an aunt in a coastal region called Konkan in Maharashtra, India. Being very ancient, paranormal events are very common in Konkan, with divine and maleficent in nature. The aunt's house happened to be very close to a crematorium. Once a pundit, or priest, advised her to hang a black doll on the front of their door to keep any evil spirits away. But the aunt dismissed it, saying that she doesn't believe in ghosts. Fast forward a few months, my friend's friend, let's call her Maya, was visiting her for a few days. One morning, Maya just wasn't waking up. She was breathing, but was unresponsive, kind of like a coma. The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong either. They were planning to take Maya to the hospital when they followed the pundit's advice as a Hail Mary. Then Maya woke up with a startle. Her parents and aunt were shocked, but happy, and asked her what happened. She said that she was having a sort of dream. A lady invited her to her home and gave her a lot of toys to play with. Maya knew that she had to go home, but the woman just kept on bringing her one toy after another. Then she said, "You're having a great time, aren't you? You should just stay here now." And Maya said, "No, I gotta go home to my parents." And she left. And that's when she woke up in the real world. I have had a few different experiences in my life that I think are probably paranormal events. My first experience is from when I was a child, probably between 3 and 5 years old. In the town square of the Spanish city that my mother is from, there is an ice cream cafe that has been there for decades, and that is housed on the corner of a 4-story apartment building that was over 100 years old. I have vivid memories of being in the square, especially in the evening, looking up at the balconies of the apartments over the ice cream shop and seeing people looking down at the square. The people looked normal in every way except one thing. They were completely paper white, skin, hair, clothes, everything. They didn't seem menacing, evil, or sad. They were just there, looking out over the square at the people below. My family moved away from Spain, but we would go back almost every summer. I remember at around 9 or 10 being at the square and asking my family, where did the people who used to watch from the balconies go? I hadn't seen them on the previous trips, and not on this one either. My mother and aunts and uncles looked at me like I was crazy. It was impossible for me to have seen people on the balconies, as the apartments above the ice cream cafe were condemned, and no one had lived in them for decades, they told me. I was in shock. The images were still in my head. I know I'd seen them there as a younger child. They say that young children who haven't lost their innocence can see things older people can't. I wonder if that was anything to do with it. The next 3 events happened in the Philippines when I was 11 or 12 years old. My younger brother was 8 or 9 at the time, and I were staying at an aunt's home in Pampanga region. We were boisterous boys, always being noisy, playing pranks, the typical things boys do. My aunt and older cousins would tell us not to be loud as this could draw the ire of spirits and magical beings. Of course, we didn't believe it and seemed like nonsense. My brother and I were sleeping in the detached guest house from the main house one night when all of a sudden, the windows started rattling and we heard a loud shushing noise outside. Then a floating candle appeared at one of the windows and started moving across it, and then appeared at all of the next windows. My brother and I started screaming and ducked under the covers of one bed together. We eventually fell asleep from the exhaustion of being scared. After that night, we decided not to sleep in the guest house alone anymore. So we were given a spare bedroom in the main house. A few nights after the candle incident, we were awakened to the sound of the family dogs barking wildly. We looked out the window and saw some sort of shadowy beat with glowing red eyes near where the doghouse was. All of a sudden, the dogs started to whimper, and finally all the barking went silent. We tore away from the window and again ducked under the covers. The next morning, it was discovered that one of the dogs had puppies, but they were all dead. Then finally, on the day that my brother and I were leaving my aunt's home, we were in the car in the back seat. No one was in the front of the car. It was early afternoon and broad daylight. All of a sudden, the horn on the car started going off wildly. The windshield wipers came on. The car lights flicked on and off. This lasted roughly about a minute. It wasn't as scary because it was during the day, but we wondered what was going on. My family joked that the spirits were happy the loud little boys were leaving, and there would soon be peace and quiet. Those are my direct experiences. It's been years since I'd had anything else happen, but I'm always waiting for it to happen. I hope to have some insight, comments, advice, or help on what happened about 2 weeks ago. I am a little familiar with the black-eyed children phenomenon, but I need some help to identify what exactly happened to help 2 family members who have not been right since this sighting. In 2013, I moved with my family to a foreclosed 6-bedroom home on 14 acres straight up in the middle of nowhere, and the Picanos. My father and I noticed very weird things going on the second we moved in, but my mother and sister seemed to not notice these things. Everyone besides me and my dad and my entire family are the, oh, it was the wind type of people, if you get what I mean. And there is some evidence that the entire area of where this house is located is haunted. Now, historically speaking, with actual evidence, people settled here around the old mill area long ago and brutally killed many Iroquois natives. This area is very spread out over miles of heavily wooded mountains. 2 weeks ago, my uncle on my mother's side and his girlfriend came to visit my parents' home. They do this quite often as my parents always have people over for beer, games, bonfires, etc. I just want to start off by saying, my uncle is a non-believer, a Harley rider who to this day, I have never seen him really scared of anything or anyone. My uncle and his girlfriend are playing foosball with my parents when they realize it's 12:30 a.m., so they decide to head home. They take all back roads, and once they turn onto Running Valley Road, that was 6 minutes from the house, my uncle's girlfriend sees 2 figures up further away. It was 2 small figures waiting to cross the road. Just to mention, there was nothing out here. No houses besides one abandoned that was still 2 miles up the road. Only thing in the vicinity is a cave. These figures were attempting to cross the road to go into the woods, which was very odd due to the time and location. They are now approaching these figures, and the headlights start to shine directly on them. Both my uncle and his girlfriend see two young girls, aged 9 and 11 approximately. One much bigger than the other, wearing what my uncle best describes as early 1900s church clothing, like dresses to the knees with white cotton shawls or cropped sweaters and flats. Weird, right? What are two 10-year-olds doing at 12:30 a.m. in the middle of nowhere wearing church clothing? They also noticed the bigger child had her arms wrapped around the smaller one, like you would do if she was hurt, scared, or cold. My uncle's girlfriend is like, "It's children. We need to stop and help." At this point, the truck is almost right next to the little girls. Both had their heads down. So then the bigger of the two starts to pick her head up to look at the passing vehicle. And both my uncle and his girlfriend notice the girl has no eyes. Just black holes, as if they were carved straight from her face. My girlfriend says, "What the hell was that? You saw that, right? Oh my God, turn around and go back right now." My uncle, scared out of his mind, takes off flying to get home. And they get home and get into an argument because she wants to drive back and see what was up. Grabs her own car keys, and my uncle basically was like, "You're not going back there. We are never going on that road again." He calls my parents in an extreme panic, tells them, and they start bugging because they know he would never lie or be that freaked out if it wasn't warranted. So my mom starts to tell me everything. Keep in mind, my family knows nothing of the Black Eye Kids and never heard of it before. I send my mom an article to forward to my uncle with some of the very basic info: young kids, no eyes, dreadful feeling, sometimes outdated clothing, hitchhiking or at your door, looking for help, etc. Now my whole family is bugging. Please let me know what you all think, or let me know if you experienced something similar to this. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please give a like, leave a comment, and subscribe. Perhaps click the bell for notifications, and remember, hell is empty, and the devils are here.